Explosions, men yelling, and the sound of gunfire filled the air. This normally beautiful, tropical part of the Philippines was riddled with bullet holes and enormous ships. The bright blue seas were soon to be host to multiple shipwrecks, as this short, 5-day period would see the deaths of hundreds of men and the sinking of many powerful ships, marking a turning point in World War II. Welcome to Fast Facts Friday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for our younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. This week we do a run-through of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which was the largest naval engagement in World War II. Let's begin with the setup for this engagement, as with battles there's always setup. It's important to note that during this time, the U.S. 7th Fleet contained units of both the U.S. Navy and the Royal Australian Navy. Before the major naval actions in Leyte Gulf had begun, HMAS Australia and USS Honolulu were attacked by Japanese air attacks and were badly damaged. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, these two cruisers were retiring and were escorted by HMAS Warramunga for repairs at the major Allied base at Manus Island, leaving 3 ships out of this battle. There was also a lack of unified command structures at play that would cause some difficulties during this battle. The U.S. 3rd Fleet, which was commanded by Admiral William F. Halsey Jr., alongside Task Force 38 commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher, would provide more distant cover and support for the invasion being planned. A fundamental defect in this plan was that there was no single American naval admiral in charge of the whole thing. Kinkaid fell under MacArthur as Supreme Allied Commander Southwest Pacific, whereas Halsey's 3rd Fleet reported to Nimitz as C&C Pacific Ocean areas. This, partnered with failures in communication, was a storm of crisis and near-strategic disaster in the making. Luckily for the Americans, the Japanese plan used 3 separate fleets and also lacked an overall commander. Speaking of the Japanese plans, let's look at that briefly. The Imperial Japanese could look at the situation and see most of the Americans' options. The combined fleet chief, Somo Toyota, prepared 4 victory plans. Shogo 1, a major naval operation in the Philippines, and Shogo 2, 3, and 4, which were responses to attacks on Formosa, the Ryukyu Islands, and Kuril Islands, respectively. The plans called for complex offensive operations, committing nearly all available forces to a decisive battle, despite substantially depleting Japan's slender reserves of fuel oil. Japan was going all in, and the results of this operation would mean winning or losing World War II. Meanwhile, the Americans were planning on landing in Leyte Gulf, and to protect their troops landing there, Halsey began a series of carrier raids against Formosa and the Ryukyu Islands on October 12, 1944. The goal was to prevent Japanese aircraft in this area from attacking the troops landing at Leyte. In response, Shogo 2 was activated for the Japanese and they moved in on Formosa, launching air attacks against the 3rd Fleet's carriers. However, this did little, if anything. The Japanese were completely shut out, losing 600 aircraft in just 3 days, almost their entire air strength in the region. After the American victory, the Japanese shifted gears, instead transitioning to Shogo 1. Let's look at Shogo 1, shall we? It utilized 3 fleets: the Northern Force, the Southern Force, and the Central Force. Vice Admiral Jisoburo Ozawa's Northern Force ships would lure the American forces away from Leyte, consisting of several aircraft carriers, but they had little aircraft or trained aircrew. The carriers were to act as bait. While the U.S. was lured away, the Southern Force, led by Vice Admirals Shoji Nishimura and Kiyohide Shima, would strike at the landing area via Surigao Strait. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's Center Force, which was by far the most powerful, would pass through the San Bernardino Strait into the Philippine Sea, turn southwards, and then also attack the landing area. That's the setup to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And now it's time to set up the rest of the episode. If you are enjoying this episode and want to hear more about ships, their careers, and their wrecks, check out our main show, Shipwreck Sunday, every Sunday night at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Okay, time to break down this battle into bite-sized battles. There's multiple battles within this larger battle, and we'll go over all of them briefly in chronological order. The first is referred to by a couple of names: the fight in the Palawan Passage or the Battle of the Palawan Passage. Either way, it's our first stop. Kurita's center force sortied from its main base in Brunei, and sortying, for our younger audience members, is to come out from a defensive position to make an attack. The center force consisted of 15 destroyers, 2 light cruisers called Noshiro and Yahagi, 10 heavy cruisers, Atago, Maya, Takao, Shokai, Miyoko, Haguro, Kumano, Suzuya, Tone, and Chikuma, and 5 battleships: Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, Haruna, and Kongo, the subject of this Sunday's episode. The center force passed Palawan Island around midnight on October 22nd to 23rd of 1944. At this time, American submarines Darter and Dace were positioned together on the surface nearby. At 1:16 a.m. on October 23rd, Darter's radar detected the Japanese force in the Palawan Passage about 30,000 yards away. Quickly, her captain made visual contact, and the 2 submarines zipped off in pursuit of the center force. Darter made 3 contact reports, and at least one of these was picked up by Yamato. However, Kurita did not take appropriate anti-submarine precautions. Darter and Dace traveled for several hours at the surface and managed to get ahead of the center force, intending to attack submerged at first light. Surprisingly, it was unusually successful. At 5:24 a.m., Darter fired a salvo of 6 torpedoes, and at least 4 hit Kurita's flagship, Atago. 10 minutes later, Darter landed 2 hits on Atago's sister ship, Takao, and at 5:56, Dace made 4 torpedo hits on Maya, sister ship to Atago and Takao. Atago and Maya quickly sank. Atago so quickly that Kurita was forced to swim away from the wreck to survive. He was rescued by the destroyer Kishinami and then transferred to Yamato. Takao was escorted back to Brunei, and Darter ran aground chasing her down. She was left there and her crew was rescued by Dace. Now we move on to the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th, 1944. This one is a big one and we will be abbreviating it. We can always come back in greater detail at a later date. One of the most important things to note here is that while the Third Fleet was incredibly stacked, they were not well placed to deal with the impending threat. The strongest carrier group was sent off to Ulithi to rearm and take on provisions, finally being recalled to the Third Fleet on October 24th. However, this delay meant that the most powerful American carrier group would play a very small part in the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. That morning on October 24th, only 3 carrier groups were available to strike Kurita's center force. While this was happening, Japanese aircraft from the 1st Air Fleet, based out of Luzon, were sent out against TG-38.3 in 3 strike waves, whose aircraft were also being used to strike airfields in Luzon to prevent Japanese land-based air attacks on Allied ships in Leyte Gulf. Each of these strike waves consisted of somewhere between 50 and 60 aircraft. Most of these planes were intercepted and shot down or driven off. However, one of these planes, a Yokosuka D4Y3 Judy, slipped through all of the defenses, and at 9:38 a.m., she hit the light carrier USS Princeton with a 551-pound armor-piercing bomb. A torpedo bomber on the deck was hit directly and exploded, triggering 5 others to explode. It also unfortunately hit where most of the torpedoes and bombs were stored, and caused a severe fire with explosions following. Princeton's explosions caused the deaths of 108, and 1,361 survivors were rescued. She would later be scuttled, being the largest American ship sunk during the battles around Leyte Gulf, and the only Independence-class fast carrier sunk in World War II. Planes launched from USS Intrepid and Cabot attacked at 10:30 a.m., scoring hits on the battleships Nagato, Yamato, and Musashi, and badly damaged the heavy cruiser Miyoko, which retired to Borneo. A second wave launched from Intrepid, Essex, and Lexington later attacked, scoring 10 more hits on Musashi. She withdrew, listing to port, and a third wave from Enterprise and Franklin struck Musashi with 11 more bombs and 8 torpedoes. She was struck with at least 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes total, finally sinking at about 7:35 p.m. In total, 5 fleet carriers and 1 light carrier of the Third Fleet flew 259 sorties with bombs and torpedoes against the center force at the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th. However, this was not nearly enough to neutralize the threat of the center force. Most of the attacks were directed at Musashi, and to be fair, she was sunk. Every other ship other than Musashi and the badly damaged Miyoko was battle-worthy. Moving on, we get into the Battle of the Surigao Strait on October 25, 1944, the last battleship-to-battleship action in history, and one of the only two to happen in the entire Pacific campaign of World War II. By this point, the Japanese line was ragged and only had one battleship, the Yamashiro, as well as one heavy cruiser and one destroyer. However, we aren't there just yet. Let's look at the Japanese forces. The Southern Force, consisting of 4 destroyers, Shigure, Michishio, Asagumo, and Yamagumo, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and 2 battleships, Fuso and Yamashiro, left Brunei on October 22nd after Kurita's forces and into the Mindanao Sea. Nishimura proceeded northeastward into the south entrance of the Surigao Strait, intending to exit the north entrance of the strait into Leyte Gulf to attack the landing troops there. The second striking force of the Southern Force, led by Shima, had the destroyers Akebono, Ushio, Kasumi, and Shiranui, as well as the light cruiser Abukuma, and the heavy cruisers Nachi and Ashigara. The Japanese Southern Force was attacked on October 24th, but suffered only minor damage. Unfortunately for them, Nishimura was unable to sync up with Shima and Kurita because of the strict radio silence imposed on the Center and Southern forces. When he entered the Surigao Strait at 2 a.m. on October 25th, Shima was 25 nautical miles behind him, and Kurita was hung up in the Sibuyan Sea, several hours from Leyte Gulf. As the Japanese approached, they sprung the trap laid by the 7th Fleet of the U.S. Navy. The fleet, led by Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, had 4 light cruisers: Denver, Columbia, Phoenix, and Boise. And yes, that is how Boise is pronounced. It's not Boise. They also had 4 heavy cruisers: Louisville, Portland, Minneapolis, and the Australian vessel HMAS Shropshire, as well as 6 battleships: West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania. And they were accompanied by 28 destroyers and 39 PT boats. This was quite the fleet. 5 of the 6 battleships in this group had been sunk or damaged in the attack on Pearl Harbor, so this was their opportunity for revenge. In order for Nishimura to pass through the strait, he'd have to go through the gauntlet of torpedoes from PT boats and destroyers first. Then he'd meet the fire of 14 battleships and cruisers. The odds weren't looking good. At 10:22 p.m., PT-131 made contact with the approaching Japanese ships. The PT boats made repeated attacks for more than 3.5 hours as Nishimura's force pushed northward. No torpedoes were scored, but the PT boats managed to send contact reports, and this was incredibly useful. Though unscathed through the PT boats, their luck ran out as Nishimura's force ran into the destroyers, also launching an onslaught of torpedoes. Both Japanese battleships of the Southern Force were hit, with Yamashiro capable of pushing forward, but Fuso fell out of formation, sinking 40 minutes later. 2 of Nishimura's 4 destroyers were sunk, and the Asagumo was hit and forced to retire, later sinking. At 3:16 a.m. on October 26th, West Virginia's radar picked up the surviving ships of Nishimura's force, and began tracking them in the darkness. At 3:53 a.m., she fired 8 of her 16-inch guns of her main battery at a range of 22,800 yards, striking Yamashiro with her first salvo. She fired a total of 93 shells, and at 3:55, California and Tennessee joined in, launching 63 and 69 shells respectively. Their superior radar fire control allowed them to attack the Japanese, but the Japanese could not fight back. The other 3 U.S. battleships, equipped with less advanced gunner radar, struggled. Pennsylvania couldn't find a target and did not fire. Maryland eventually succeeded in visually ranging based upon the splashes of the other battleship's shells and fired 48 shells. And Mississippi only fired once, a full salvo of 12 shells. This was the last salvo ever fired by a battleship against another battleship in history, marking the end of the era of the battleship. If you want more information on that, we do have a video on the decline of the battleship if you are interested. Yamashiro and Mogami were crippled and struggled, with Shigure able to turn and flee but losing all steering and stopping dead in her tracks. At 4:05, Yamashiro was struck by a torpedo from the destroyer Benyon, and she sank at 4:20, with Nishimura on board. Mogami and Shigure retreated southwards. Shima's force headed into the strait about 40 miles astern of Nishimura, initially thrown into confusion. Despite the difficult conditions making it hard for PT boats to track these ships, PT-137 struck the light cruiser Abukuma with a torpedo that crippled her, and she fell from formation. As for the results of this engagement, the only ship of Nishimura's to survive long enough to escape was Shigure, but she was still sunk by USS Blackfin on January 24, 1945. Shima's ship survived, but they were all sunk in later engagements around Leyte. The southern force was effectively wiped out. Next, we get into the Battle off Samar on October 25, 1944, running at the same time as the Battle of the Surigao Strait. Task Unit Taffy 3 was caught off guard by Kurita's center force, and the aircraft carriers retreated under the cover of a rain squall. Kurita was unaware that the decoy plan had succeeded, and so he thought he was facing Halsey's Third Fleet. Having just redeployed his ships into anti-aircraft formation, he further complicated things by ordering a general attack, which called for his fleet to split into divisions and attack independently. The destroyer USS Johnston was the closest to the enemy, and they were well aware they were outclassed when they attacked using torpedoes against the heavy cruiser Kumano, damaging her and forcing her out of line. Seeing this, the order, quote, "small boys attack," rang out, and the rest of Taffy 3's screening ships launched. Taffy 3's two other destroyers, Hull and Heermann, as well as the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, attacked with suicidal determination, drawing fire and disrupting the Japanese formation as ships turned to avoid their torpedoes. Lieutenant Commander Copeland of Samuel B. Roberts watched as the ships approached the enemy columns and grabbed the bullhorn, calling out to all hands that this would be, quote, "a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival could not be expected." As the Japanese fleet approached, Hull and Samuel B. Roberts were hit multiple times, and quickly sank. Samuel B. Roberts took 90 of her 210 crew with her, and she is the deepest shipwreck ever discovered at a depth of 22,621 feet. All 16 escort carriers of Taffy 3 launched their aircraft early on in the battle, totaling 450 planes. They were not as well equipped as Halsey's fleet, but they would do. The Japanese had no air cover, and so the planes attacked unopposed from the air. The American defense was ferocious, seemingly confirming for the Japanese that this was the Third Fleet even though it wasn't. The confusion from the general attack order was compounded by air and torpedo bombardment, with Yamato, Kurita's flagship, turning north to evade torpedoes and losing contact with the battle. Abruptly, Kurita broke off the fight and ordered, quote, "all ships, my course north, speed 20, apparently to regroup the disorganized fleet. Kurita's battle report states that he had information there was a group of American carriers north, and so he preferred to expend his fleet against capital ships rather than transports. In doing this, he lost his opportunity to destroy the shipping fleet in Leyte Gulf, failing to disrupt the crucial landings in Leyte. He lost 3 destroyers, and judging from the resistance he just faced, he was convinced he'd only lose more ships if he continued. The combination of poor communication between the separate Japanese forces and a lack of air reconnaissance meant that he never knew the deception was successful. Had he known this, he would have known that he stood a chance. Instead, he assumed the Third Fleet was going to surround them and annihilate them. Almost all of his surviving force escaped. Nagato and Kongo were moderately damaged by air attack, and he begun with 5 battleships, only returning with Yamato and Haruna intact and battle-worthy. In desperation, kamikaze attacks were launched against Allied ships in Leyte Gulf and the escort carrier units off Samar. St. Lo was sunk, and Kilinan Bay, Kitkun Bay, and White Plains were damaged during this attack. And now we have one final engagement in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the battle off Cape Engaño on October 25th and 26th of 1944. The northern force was built around the 4 aircraft carriers of the 3rd Carrier Division, the aircraft carriers Zuho, Chitose, Chiyoda, and the last surviving carrier that had attacked Pearl Harbor, Zuikaku, as well as 2 World War I battleships partially converted into carriers, Hyuga and Ise. There were also 3 light cruisers, Oyota, Tama, and Izuzu, and 9 destroyers. This was the decoy force to lure away the American fleet protecting Leyte Island. Ironically enough, the name of the cape, Engaño, is Spanish for deception. The northern force was finally located at 4:40 on October 24th. Ironically enough, they wanted to be found, but they were the most difficult for the Third Fleet to locate. The 3 groups of Mitcher's TF-38 that Halsey was taking with him was overwhelmingly more powerful than the northern force. It consisted of the 5 large aircraft carriers Lexington, Franklin, Intrepid, Enterprise, and Essex, the 5 light carriers Independence, Bella Wood, Langley, Cabot, and San Jacinto, The 6 modern battleships Alabama, Iowa, Massachusetts, New Jersey, South Dakota, and Washington, 8 cruisers, and 41 destroyers. The air groups of the 10 carriers carried about 600 to 1,000 aircraft. At dawn, Ozawa launched 75 aircraft, the bulk of his tiny arsenal of planes, and they set out to attack the Third Fleet. Most were shot down by American combat air patrols, and none of the U.S. ships suffered damage. A few Japanese planes survived and flew to the land bases on Luzon. At dawn the following morning on October 26th, a first wave of 180 aircraft was launched before the northern force was located. They made contact at 7:10 a.m., and the strike wave orbited ahead of the task force. At 8 a.m., the attack went in, and the escorting fighters destroyed Ozawa's combat air patrol of 30 planes. U.S. airstrikes continued into the evening, flying 527 sorties against the northern force. They sunk Zuikaku, Chitose, Zuiho, and Akizuki, a destroyer, with all heavy loss of life. The light carrier Chiyoda and the cruiser Tama were crippled, with Ozawa transferring his flag to the light cruiser Oyoda. At 11:10 p.m. that night, the American submarine Dyalla torpedoed and sank the light cruiser Tama, and this was the last act of the battle off Cape Engaño. And other than some final airstrikes on the retreating Japanese forces on October 26th, this was the conclusion of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. In total, the U.S. lost 12 warships in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and more than 1,600 sailors and aircrew men were killed. As for the Japanese, they lost 28 warships, and numbers vary for deaths and injuries. According to the U.S. Department of Defense, 419,912 Japanese were killed. According to the U.S. Army Center of Military History, roughly 49,000 were lost. We might not ever know for sure, but that is a large number nonetheless. The loss at the Battle of Leyte Gulf was the final nail hammered in the coffin for the Imperial Japanese in World War II. For the Americans, it was an incredible victory that hastened the end of the war and pushed the Allies one step closer to ending the bloodiest conflict in human history. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our World War II warships playlist in the cards. Stay tuned this Sunday for the story of the Japanese battleship Kongo, the only battleship sunk by a submarine in World War II. Thank you for tuning into Fast Facts Friday, have a lovely weekend, and we'll see you next time.